Welcome to another training session online. Today we're going to be talking about a little bit about goal writing and also about providing services in a more inclusive way for speech and also for related services. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in 90 minutes. So I may be going very fast, so I'll apologize to Faith, who is our captioner today, because sometimes I get to talking very fast. She is going to be providing closed captions, so if you would like to see the captions, you can enable that in your toolbar. I would also invite you to use the chat anytime that you have questions, or if you just want to make general comments, go ahead and use the chat. But change the drop-down menu to say everyone. Otherwise, only Faith and I will be able to see it. And so if you want everyone to see that, you're going to have to change the default. I would ask that you don't use the Q&A feature, only because that'll give me one more box to have open on my screen, and I want to make sure that I can pay attention to all of these. We're a pretty small group, so I know this is in webinar mode, which means your cameras are off and your microphones are disabled. But if you did want to make a comment, if you could just mention it in the chat, and I can have your microphone turned on at that point. So my name is Angie McKinney, and I'm one of the consultants with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I'm a school psychologist by background. So I'm not a speech pathologist or a related service provider, but have done this training numerous times with one of our former staff members, Christy Wright, who is a speech pathologist. So we kind of work together as we develop this. But I want to recognize, though, that you out there who have different backgrounds know a lot more about your content area. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert in any of your content areas. I really just want to make sure that we apply this, any services that we apply to students, that we think about making them happen in the most inclusive way possible. That is not always possible for every situation, every skill, or every student. But there are a lot of students who might be receiving some pull-out services that would actually benefit a little more from having those provided inclusively. All right, so I want to start by sharing the Padlet, and I'm going to put that in the chat again for those of you who weren't here in the very beginning. On this Padlet, you're going to find a couple of copies of this PowerPoint handout, a little bit longer version, since this is normally a mostly full day training. I just went ahead and left all of the slides in. Obviously, we had to scale this back for an online training, but I wanted to make sure you had access to all of those. So you can download that there. There are also a number of other resources, handouts, websites, things that you can tap into in order to support you in this effort. So check those out, please. So I hear people use the term inclusion kind of like a verb, right? We're going to do inclusion, or we have an inclusion room, using it as an adjective. This is our inclusion room. We're going to have an inclusion class. I'm an inclusion teacher, right? We use it kind of in a way that maybe isn't exactly what we were meaning. So I really like this cartoon of, you don't do it, you live it. It is a mindset. It's a different way of thinking about how to provide services. So the agenda for today, for our short time this morning, we're going to kind of breeze through looking at least restrictive environment and that concept, and thinking about really, what does that mean? What does that mean as we plan out what we do for students? Think a little bit about the shift in mindset that needs to happen in order to make some of these things occur. And then we'll talk about goal writing. A little overview of co-teaching models, because co-teaching is one of the places that a lot of you might be able to plug into in the classroom in order to provide services in a more inclusive way. And then we'll talk a little bit about communication. And at that point, I'll refer back to some of the documents that are on the Padlet in helping to communicate some of the message of why do we want to do this? What are we thinking? How do we get the message to our coworkers, to our kids, to our parents? And then we'll do a little wrap up at the end. So I will try my best to end on time. So we're going to start with LRE, or least restrictive environment. And this is straight out of what the law says. This is straight out of Article 7. It says that as much as we can, to the maximum extent appropriate, that students that have disabilities need to be educated with their non-disabled peers as much as they can, to the maximum extent appropriate, which does not mean the same thing as every kid all day gen ed setting. That's not what that means. It means that if it's possible, we need to do it. We need to not remove them from their general ed peers. It goes on to say that anything different than that, so pulling out into a special classroom, a different school, or any kind of removal from the gen ed setting is only supposed to happen if the nature of the disability or the severity of the disability kind of sets up a situation where we can't use the general ed setting, along with providing supplemental aids and services. So I think sometimes what we do is we forget that little piece about using supplementary aids and services and just read it as if the nature and severity of the disability is such that education in the gen ed classes can't be satisfactorily achieved. Okay, well, there are a lot of kids that struggle in the gen ed setting with the curriculum, with the environment, but many times there are supplementary aids and services that could be provided in that setting that would make it possible. And I see, and I've experienced this myself. I've advocated for this myself, and looking back, I'm like, what was I thinking? But we go from thinking about gen ed to thinking about a little bit of resource or pull-out time without really considering that step in between of, is there any way we can make it work in the gen ed setting? So we have a range of placements, and these placements aren't, they're really determined by both the setting that the student is in and the amount of time that they're pulled away from their general education peers. So it really ranges for students from kids who are in the gen ed classroom all day with just a little bit of support, to kids who are in the general education classroom all day but are getting a lot more support, to kids who have a little bit of pull-out time, whether it's resource, going into speech, getting OT, any of those kinds of things, to a little bit more or to a lot of pull-out service, even to the point of being a separate classroom within the building, and still may go out and receive some of their time with other students, but many kids are in a separate classroom a good part of the day. All the way down to going to a different school, going into a residential facility. And then the most restrictive placement is homebound or hospital setting. Now, that doesn't really seem logical to most people. I think, well, residential setting would be a lot more restrictive. And along the continuum, they have homebound or hospital placed on the end, because most of the time, even if I'm in residential, I may still be in a full day kind of program. And many times when I'm in a hospital setting or a homebound setting, the instructional piece is pretty minimal for whatever reason. And there are some kids that truly need that. We make good decisions to the extent that we can every time we have an IEP meeting. But we also tend to use homebound placement for many students who are struggling with behavior. And we jump to homebound before thinking about all of the different things that we could do prior to getting all the way to the end of that continuum. So when we think about being inclusive and really providing inclusion as a way of educating students and using that mindset, there are a lot of different, I guess, versions of inclusion that we see. I think many times, if you're as old as I am, you may remember a situation where kids with special needs, some of them didn't even come to school. Our main special ed law didn't occur until the mid-70s, and I was kind of starting kindergarten about then. So it was kind of a new thing for many schools to even have special education as a thing. There were some kids in my neighborhood that I don't know where they went, but they weren't in my school. And then if you look at kind of that second, these look like Petri dishes to me, but if you look at that second graphic along the continuum, suddenly we had students that had disabilities in school, but many of them were in a separate room. In my school, we had Mrs. Blackburn's room, which was a separate little classroom down the hallway. And many of the students who went down there, they may have come back to our class for art or music or something like that, but many of them did not have any academic time with us. So you can see that students with disabilities are kind of grouped, but they're outside of the main circle. Then we started doing a lot more push-in service, which is great, but sometimes that push-in service is creating almost a little mini special ed room within a general ed classroom. So if you have services happening in the classroom in a small group, maybe at the back table of the room, but every student within that group has a disability, then really it's a special education setting. In my mind, if I'm being educated with students that all have disabilities, that's not a general education setting, even if it's within the general education room. Getting a little bit more on the inclusive end is when we start mixing it up. We start providing those push-in services where any provider can work with any student and the groups are nice and mixed up, which is fantastic for kids in general because they are benefiting from kids who are higher and kids who are lower in certain skills than they are. There's a lot to be learned from peer models and from Kid Speak. And those things typically happen within that general education classroom. And then finally, that last representation, I think we're not really there yet. That's kind of the ideal of, there's not a clear separation between the green students, right? The kids without disabilities, and then these other kids with various disabilities. It's just that everyone's unique, everyone's included, and their unique characteristics are valued. So I want you to think about where you are right now. And I know there are just a few of us on here, but I hope I have a poll in here. I sure do. I'm going to launch this poll, and I just want you to identify when you're providing services, or if you're not a provider, if you just think about what's going on in your schools, what does it look like? What do those kinds of services look like for students? Is it all pull out? Is it some push in? What exactly is happening? So I'll give you just a minute to identify that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. About half of you have identified where you are. And I see a mix here of I'm hoping you can still see that. I see a mix here of things like some push in, right? Some push in that is with all students, some that is with students in a small group that are all students that have specific needs, and then also still some pull-out services. And that's typical. In fact, you guys representatively are probably having a little more inclusive services than many people. There are a lot of schools that still stick to that very traditional model of if you get speech, if you get PT, OT, social work services, blind low vision services, any of those things, it is outside of the classroom. It is in a small group with other kids who have similar needs. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mindset. And if you just think, now, wait a minute, you want me to do what? And that's kind of the reaction that we get. Wait, what do you want me to do here? This is different than what I've been used to doing. This is different than what I was maybe taught in school. Hopefully over time, some of that has shifted. And, depending on how many years that you've been doing this, depending on who was your supervisor when you were doing your first experiences in schools, that may have shaped a lot of how you do things. It's also very possible that many of you, when you came into your jobs, were replacing someone who had an existing caseload, who had an existing schedule, and you're just filling right into the niche that was already there. And it's sometimes really difficult to make those changes. So as we talk about mindset, one of the things that we have to really remember is the difference between the medical model and the education model of how we do things and how we write goals. Who is eligible for what and who isn't within the school setting. That's a hard conversation. And I'm sure some of you have been through that conversation before, where you're trying to explain to a teacher or to a parent why a student doesn't qualify for a particular service, but yet they're getting it in an outside office through their insurance. It's a hard sell, but there is definitely a difference. Now, I want to share some resources, and I know you can't click on these links that are here, and we don't have time to go into all of them. But if you go to that Padlet again, I've uploaded these different articles and web pages that talk about some of those things, talk about the differences between what we do in schools and what we do in medical kinds of settings. Some of this is more related to OT and speech, but you can take those same concepts and apply them to any of the areas that we're thinking about. Now, there is a big difference between speech and related services. And those of you who are speech pathologists, you know this stuff, right? Speech is a primary special education service. That's why our SLPs can all be teachers of record if a student is only a student with a language disability or language impairment or a speech impairment, because they are the teacher. This is a primary area. Now, in contrast, any of our related services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, social work services, counseling services, any of those things, a student has to require those services in order to benefit from their primary special education services. That's hard to figure out sometimes, right? There has to be that need in the educational setting for a particular skill. We have to connect that back to why a student might need something. So again, you may have a student who qualifies under insurance for some outside services, but yet if we don't feel like they need that service in order to benefit from their special ed service, then they don't qualify. So that kind of changes somewhat how we do the evaluations. And again, I'm not going to pretend to know your different areas of expertise. You know how to evaluate students. And for those of you who have also worked in an outside setting, whether it's a clinic or a nursing home or any place like that, you know that the evaluation process can be somewhat different because you're proving different things. We are relying on the eligibility criteria through Article 7 for a primary, so for language impairment or speech impairment. But then we are also looking for those related services of how does getting that related service affect my ability to benefit from my special education program that was designed. And then goals can be a little bit different too. So when you determine goals, we have to think about goals that help make you very functional in your educational setting. What do we need to work on that's going to help you to benefit from your services? Whether it's emotional regulation, whether it's sensory regulation, increasing fine motor skills. But what we don't want to do is determine what kind of goals that we write that are centered around the test questions that you got right or got wrong during the evaluation. And I think that's a little bit of a shift for some people, not for everyone, but for some people, they are used to being able to write their goals based on specific kinds of things that you got wrong during the evaluation. So we want to look at goals. So again, they're functional and they're meaningful. We want to think about life changers. If this kid could just do this, life would be so much better. They would benefit more from what's going on here at school. They would be able to be more successful with things if we could just teach this skill. Those are the kind of goals that you really want to center on. So that all starts with present levels. And this is nothing new to anyone here. We've got to have truly present levels, right? They have to be current. That has been a struggle for a lot of people during COVID. And it's been a struggle because sometimes we haven't had much contact with some of our kids. I think it's better now that we've got a lot more in-person instruction going on. But there was a good chunk of time where you may have had a kid on your caseload that you couldn't get to log on to a computer and you had no access to them. So the only data you had was old data. Now, I think we can all kind of just get past that because there were a lot of mistakes coming up in IEPs that we didn't have any control over. But it is incredibly important to make sure that anytime we have an IEP meeting that we update those present levels to truly be current data. If you've got anything that's more than a few months old, get that stuff out of there and gather something new, even if it's something small, a quick assessment, a quick observation of what's going on skill-wise, gathering new information from the classroom teacher that tells you about certain skills, all of those kinds of things. So they have to be current, but it also has to be relevant. I mean, the important stuff is what we need. We need to know what things are okay, what things are not. And we need to make sure that we're covering both the academic performance and the functional performance. And sometimes some of the functional stuff gets left out, but this is where you guys shine. The functional is where you guys will have the most information because you're looking into behavior, motor, language, communication, all of those different things that maybe don't even get thought about for a lot of our students that have those high incidence disabilities like specific learning disability. We're thinking on the academic end more than anything. But our kids who need related service, which we know some of those are kids with specific learning disabilities, we've got to have those functional areas into. So when we're writing present levels for a student, and this is not something that you ever want to copy paste, because obviously this is made up and it's for just a specific example. But we want to talk in our present levels kind of about three different things about what can you already do. So we're getting at some of the strengths and some of the skills that you've already mastered, because what we don't want to do is spend our time working on the things that you already can do. Then we want to talk about the things that you're trying to do, but you're just maybe either not fluent with yet, or you've just not quite mastered the skill yet. And then what can't you do yet? Right? It's always the yet, because that's the stuff we're going to work on. You should be able to read the present levels of performance to a student, or for a student, and figure out what goals we likely need. So we want to make sure we get enough detail in there. You don't need to write a book, but you do need to make sure that you have enough to be able to just go straight into writing a goal, And it's usually either the things that I am starting to do but not very good at yet, and I need to monitor that, or kind of that just next step of what would be the next thing. Once I get this mastered, what's the next thing that we really need to work on? So when we're creating goals, again, this shouldn't be anything new to you guys. There are three parts to making sure that we have goals that are both skill-based and relevant and measurable. And the measurable piece is definitely important, but the other two pieces are important as well. We've got to have a skill in there. It should never be a goal for a test, or a goal for a score on a test that really doesn't include a skill necessarily. So we've got to have a target skill. So what can't the student do now that we think if we could get them to do it, if we could teach and reinforce that skill, they are going to be in a better situation. They're going to be better able to learn, better able to make it through the whole day, better able to use their materials. Whatever it is, communicate with their peers. What should we target? And you all know that you work on a million things with students. You don't just work on the things that are listed in your goals. And you can't write a goal for everything that you work on, or we would have 100-page IEPs. So think of the biggest, right? The most important things that if we did nothing else over the course of the next year, if I could teach these particular skills, these are the ones that are going to make or break this student. That's what you want to focus on. So the target skill, then we want to have that component of what are either the conditions that we would expect to see the skill, or the conditions that would lead to the skill being used. Because there are lots of skills that we don't use all the time. I don't use my calm down strategies all day long because I'm not faced with stress all day long. Some of you might be faced with stress all day long, and I'm so sorry for you, but there's some skills that if you think about the kids that you work with and some of the goals that you write, you don't expect to see it all day. So it may be that kind of situation that you're talking about, the conditions, or it also could be the stimulus material that's needed. So when provided with 3 visual choices, that's the stimulus material. When given options for coping skills, when provided with an agenda, when given a verbal prompt, those are the materials or the stimulus that are needed in order to see that skill. And then you want to have that criterion for acceptable performance. So that's your measurable piece of, at what point that when I see it, do I know that they're there? They reach that goal. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about each of these. Of course, I get ahead of myself. So we want to think about the skill again. So if our specially designed instruction is working, then what will the student be able to do at the end of that IEP? What are they working? And you want to use specific words that help make sure that you will be able to see or hear that skill, right? There are a lot of things that we might say that I'm really not able to tell whether it happened or whether it didn't happen. And these specific words, things like demonstrate, that's a hard one. Increase, identify, understand. Those all sound like great words, but if I say a student will recognize words when shown, words will recognize the correct spelling of the word. Well, I know what that means, but someone else may not really be able to identify if a kid has recognized it. So when they recognize it, is it that, their pupils dilate because we know that they went, aha, right? Or that they have an eye gaze towards something, or they point to that letter? Spell out exactly what we're talking about, that they'll write it, they'll touch it, they'll circle it, whatever it is that we're looking for. So clearly, if I'm looking at it and if Elena is looking at it, we will come to the same conclusion about did it happen or did it not. So use the verbs that will really get you to something that's clearer. So again, the condition or with the stimulus, we talked about this a little bit, and there are some additional examples. There are some things that, especially if you're working with communication skills or behavior, you might have a goal that is really focused on a certain setting. Because sometimes that's where we're starting. I don't expect you to have that skill all the time, but I want to see it first in that small group setting. Or maybe I want to see it during individual instruction if I'm working to increase some of those communication skills or some of the emotional regulation or something like that. So again, think about either kind of that context, the environment, or what is needed in order to kind of prompt that behavior or skill to happen. And then that last piece is the measurable piece. So how am I going to know if it happened or not? Give me something clear to identify at what level would be considered, you got it, you're there. And it really depends on the skill that you're talking about. So you may be looking at accuracy. So, how much of it was correct, whether it's the number correct, the percentage correct. It may be a fluency issue. So for some, it's how fast can you do certain things. Duration. Some of our kids that are dealing with behavior or just general learning behaviors of, sticking with something, it's about trying to increase the amount of time that they're able to do something, or that they're using a certain skill. And for others, it may be a latency. So we have a lot of kids that we're dealing with behavior that we have teachers that will give a directive, and then 2 minutes later, the student still hasn't done something. So you may be working on decreasing the time for the student to respond to something. And it may not always be behavior. It may even be within the processing that we're looking to get a kid to see a certain cue and then move on something to get started. A lot of this has to do with, or it fits really well for things like organizational skills, behaviors, or even recognizing certain visuals so that they then cue into what they need to do next. So just a couple of examples, and these are pretty simple examples. Gail will correctly articulate all phonemes in spontaneous conversation with 90% accuracy and no cueing. So her specific skill is articulating phonemes. And we're looking at the condition of spontaneous conversation. That's when we want to see it. Not scripted, not, practice. We're looking at, can she do this in spontaneous conversation? Now, again, this is for Gail. So it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for another student. 90% accuracy is the piece that's measurability. And we also have another condition that's in there, which is no cueing, right? Because we could cue and maybe get a different result. So that when we just look at the numbers and her accuracy, it makes a difference whether we're talking about 90% with cueing or 90% with no cueing. So definitely a little bit different there. Small group settings, she will say developmentally appropriate speech sounds, and we give examples of those because developmentally appropriate, some people don't know what that means. So we need to have some kind of description in there to make it very clear and pass that stranger test for if some random person gets this IEP tomorrow because Gail decided to move. When creating a sentence, so that's kind of a condition, given a word or a picture with no cueing, so more conditions there, or stimulus materials, in 9 of 10 trials in 5 observations. Now, and I know we can't really have good conversation on this, but do you guys see any problem? And if you can type in the chat, if you see any problem with this particular goal, the way it's written. For me, it's when we start layering on extra pieces of the measurability, sometimes it gets a little convoluted. Yeah, absolutely, Carrie. 9 out of 10 trials in 5 observations. And I see this kind of stuff, or I'll see 80% accuracy on 4 out of 5 trials. I'm like, well, okay, does that mean if I get 80% on 4, but then I get 10% on the 5th one, it's creating another layer that creates some confusion to me. So really think about making it as simple as possible. And one of the things that I like to see in goals, and again, it's not always appropriate, it depends on the skill that you're working on, but when there is a criterion as far as whether you're talking about 80% accuracy or you're seeing something on, rather than doing like 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 5, I like to see on a certain number of consecutive observations or a certain number of consecutive assessments, right? Because when somebody can do something several times in a row, you pretty much think, okay, you got it now. So that's what we're looking for before we decide that a goal is no longer relevant because you've got it, you've made it, and you're ready to move on to the next thing. I want to be convinced that you're there. And I think for me, seeing that consecutive piece can be helpful. A couple of other examples. Given 4th grade level text, so that's a material that she needs. We're not talking about below grade level. Well, it depends on what grade Marcy's in, but that could be grade level, above grade level, below grade level. I'm not sure. Marcy will answer 8 out of 10 factual questions about the reading in 4 consecutive data collections. So basically, she's hitting 80% on the factual questions because that's what we're working on in 4 consecutive data collections. She'll answer WH questions using picture cues. So again, get that stimulus material or condition in there regarding a 3 to 4 sentence story given verbally with 80% accuracy. lots of ways that you can write goals. But if you think about all of these different things, like whether she can answer those WH questions when she's got some of the cues and she's been told a story, it's been read to her, and it's a short story, for her, is this life-changing? I mean, that's really what we have to ask every time that we write, a goal. What you don't want to have are goals that you would say, so what if a student mastered the goal? So if we get to the end of the IEP and we say, yes, you met all your goals, so what, right? Then that's not really the appropriate goal to work on. Are these two outcome-based goals or considered skill-based? That's a good question, right? What is the skill that we're looking at? That's what you have to dig into. And I would say that there's some skill here, right? But part of it is also outcome-based. But answering a WH question and pulling all that together is the skill. Absolutely. Well, yes. Answering that is the skill, because some kids don't know how to do that. And so our speech language pathologists are teaching, how do we use the cues? How do we figure out the who, the where, the when, the why? How do we look for facts? How do we look for inferences? There are skills behind those. So again, what you wouldn't want to see is Marcy will increase her star reading score from this to this. That's an outcome-based. Yes, we would love her to do that, but what skill are we working on? Because you should be able to say, I can look at these goals and now I know what to work on with this kid when we get together, or when I go in the classroom, or when we're in small group, wherever it is that you're providing those services, you know what to work on. But if we're working on increasing their star, decreasing their office referrals, I'm not sure what to work on. I'm working on a bunch of stuff and hoping for the best because those, again, we'd love to have those outcomes for those kids, but I don't know what skill that they have obtained and achieved that is moving them forward in being able to master their curriculum. Okay, so you probably have some reservations already, though, thinking if you're not already doing some inclusive services, how in the world do you start? You know, what are you going to do? Why in the world would we do this? So there are definitely some benefits out there. And if you think about some of the things that we can do in the classroom, it's not just a benefit to the student, it benefits the teacher, which in turn benefits the student even more, and also helps to benefit other children as well, because when the teacher's skill set increases, then they're able to solve a lot of things and support a lot of different needs in the classroom without you being in there, which is ultimately what we're looking for. It's kind of a consultation model, but you're providing that visual. So, you know, for any of you, no matter what kind of provider you are, hearing how that we rephrase things or reword things, hearing how to simplify directions, not just to state them again and maybe a little louder or slower, right? Using visuals. We can make visuals and hand them over to a teacher, but how to use them correctly in the classroom is something different. It's a deeper level of skill for the teacher. how we can support students who may be struggling with language or articulation within the general instruction going on in the classroom, right? We can build some of those things in. We have some different cueing that we can do that doesn't necessarily call out the student or say, you know, work with me, move your mouth this way, let's do this. We can support the students within how we do this in lessons in general. How to support motor skills, behavior, social skills, social emotional learning, emotional regulation, how to implement some of our supports for students with vision or hearing difficulty or loss. You know, all of those things that we do can be incredibly important. And I think I've heard a lot of providers say, okay, well, if I come in the room to do something, especially if I'm coming in to support the whole group, the teacher leaves. Like, no, pull them back in, right? When you come into a classroom, you are an additional layer of support as opposed to a replacement or a break. It's really about supporting anyone and everyone. And many of you can provide supports, just like a special ed teacher going in to the classroom. They can support anyone. They're not limited to or glued to supporting only students with IEPs. You're using the benefit of reducing that adult to student ratio to be able to provide more intensive instruction to any student who needs it. So just a little bit about co-teaching. I just want to kind of go over the models. And I want you to think about, as we talk about each of them, where could you potentially fit in? So some of you may say, well, I'm not a teacher, which is okay. We're still using the models of co-teaching whenever you go into the classroom to really get to that petri dish where things are mixed up and that you're not just pulling a group to the back of the room or just going in to work with an individual student. So one of the models is one teach, one assist, where the teacher is teaching or you are teaching, right? So some of you who may be supporting behavior, you may come in and provide a lesson, but the teacher doesn't leave. The teacher is supporting student needs that crop up during the lesson. And it allows the instruction to continue to go on and support the individual needs. And you can usually anticipate which students are likely to have difficulty. And I think this is an important part, is to think ahead about who might need some additional support. So whoever is in that assist role can keep an eye on those kids, but not hover and not sit by them. Just keep an eye on them so that you can bounce back and forth when needed. This is something that people use frequently, but not usually for whole class periods. It may be in between using other models. The thing that we want to make sure and avoid are things like talking too loud or too much to where it's distracting in the classroom. You know, when we get too many voices going on, other students may be kind of glued to wherever the assist person is. Or ending up being in the role of a paraprofessional, which you don't want to do either. All of you have got advanced skills and degrees, and you're there because you have a specialty to support things that weren't supported before you were there. So we want to make sure that you actually get used as the professionals that you are. One teach, one observe is another kind of thing where one person is instructing and the other is observing or collecting data. And I think this is a really good use in between kinds of other instructional activities that are going on, to gather data on multiple kids during this time. Because most of us don't really care what happens in our rooms, right? If something happens in the speech room, yeah, great. If something happens in the OT room, great. The behavior room, wonderful. But where it really counts is when we can see it in the classroom, when we can see it on the playground, when we can see it in the cafeteria, the places where those skills really count. And so finding a way to collect that data, or again, you're not always going to have to be the one who's collecting data. If you know what data needs to be collected, that could be something the classroom teacher is doing while you're maybe providing a little bit of instruction within the classroom. It is okay to provide instruction to everyone if it's going to support everyone. Very few things that you do are going to negatively impact anyone. You're not going to have parents running to the school board saying, this person came in and provided special ed or related services to my child doesn't have an IEP. You're part of the package. You're part of the good instruction that's happening in your buildings. And you don't need permission to share information in a classroom when you're doing push-in services. In the co-teaching models, when we're differentiating, we can use alternative teaching. And alternative teaching is typically, not always, but typically large group, small group, right? So that small group may be a group who has a specific skill need, a group who needs remediation, a group who's struggling with the vocabulary of a lesson. And so you're focused on that skill, a group who needs extension, right? There could be times when maybe you're providing vocabulary support to the large group and the teacher is working with the kids who need the extension. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. The important thing is to think about the way that you're grouping, trying to not create those situations where you have a special ed group. And I think we all know students who could benefit from some of the instruction and support that happens that don't have an identified disability or don't have an IEP or a 504 or an ILP or any of those formal plans. But we have a lot of students on our caseload that maybe have better skills than some of the kids who are not on our caseload because they just weren't eligible for special ed, right? So if you're providing vocabulary support, you may have two kids that work on vocabulary in this classroom, but then there are 2 or 3 more kids who are not on your caseload that could really benefit from some vocabulary work on a lesson. And it makes so much sense to use the vocabulary from the story, from the social studies chapter that they're working on, from whatever it is that, even sometimes math vocabulary is really difficult for a lot of kids. And making sure that we can use those words and interpret them correctly can be very valuable. Especially those vocabulary terms or words within math that now tell us what we're supposed to do. Those are always tricky for kids. And again, not just kids with disabilities, but many kids in the classroom. Parallel teaching is just splitting the class. You're going to take half, I'm going to take half. We're going to teach the same thing. And we've just got smaller groups. And so we can have more interaction going on. We can take more comments from students or get them really involved in things. There are a lot of opportunities for this. Now, as we're talking about these, I don't want you to necessarily think that if you are ever providing support in a co-teaching kind of way, that it needs to be for an entire class period. In fact, it probably shouldn't be for most of you. It might be pieces of a lesson where it would be a natural place to weave in whatever supports that you tend to be working on with students, but build it into what's going on in the classroom. Teaming is where we're both working on things, and we're playing off each other's sentences and words, and we're both actively instructing. I love team teaching when it's done well. And when it's done well, you can't tell who's who. It just looks like several teachers up there sharing information. Not always the easiest to do if you are an SLP or a related service provider, because typically you're not as immersed in the content, and you often don't have the planning time that you need to be able to truly do teaming. But if you're coming in, say you're coming in as a physical therapist or occupational therapist, and today we're going to work on some stretching exercises with the whole class, or some mindfulness exercises, or how to appropriately use the calm down kit that's in our classroom. You can team that. You guys know the content very well. So you have to really think about what it is that you're teaching and whether or not you feel comfortable in doing that. Makes a big difference about the grade level of the students that you're working with as well, or the grade level that you're providing service to. I'm going to have a lot of trouble going into a high school physics class and doing much of anything other than maybe managing anxiety for students because I don't know the content at all. All right, and then station teaching is the final one that we're going to go over. And there are some other models out there depending on which guru in co-teaching that you are following. But station teaching is probably one of the most natural places that I think you all can jump in. We're just dividing students into groups that are typically at least one more group than the number of adults that are providing instruction. So I have a station, you have a station, and there is an independent or maybe more than one independent station. And that way students can rotate around those, having them rotate sometimes in clustered groups, but many times in mixed groups to get the different skills that they need. So maybe I'm running an emotional regulation group that's just teaching a skill, one calm down strategy, something like that. And then the teacher is working on something different in that group. The things that you have to remember are when kids are at an independent group, they have to truly be able to be independent with that. So it may be that most kids can do certain things independently, but you may have one or two kids that maybe they go to one of the other groups twice because they need to be with an instructor all the time. And they could really benefit from a double dose of coping skills. Or maybe it's that most of the group is doing something independently, but then these two kids, we're going to have them do something different independently. They're going to put on headphones and they're going to listen to a story that they need to review a couple of times. So you can have some flexibility with this. But again, I want you to kind of think about this does not have to be an entire class period, but you could reach multiple students that you are focused on making sure that whatever it is that you need to work with them on gets woven into what you do in your group at your station. So if you're working on vocabulary, you may have one kid who works on vocabulary and one kid that's working on conversation skills and another that's working on articulation skills. And you think about how can I support that within this? So maybe when you're running your group is based on vocabulary, but when your artic kiddo gets to you, you're also doing some modeling and working on some of the things that you might do for articulation. Now, again, I want to recognize that this doesn't work for every skill. If you're going to do bubble blowing, you either have everybody in the class do bubble blowing so that nobody feels left out of it, or you pull a kid out and you work with them in your office on this particular skill. There are some skills that kids may not be comfortable practicing in front of other kids yet, right? But many of the things that you're doing could be supported in the general ed classroom. So definitely a natural place to kind of weave this in. So I'm going to skip this little quiz here and just look at this is kind of a way of thinking about things. As you're thinking about the different kinds of services that you could provide, they really run on a continuum of being something that takes a whole lot of collaboration to not very much collaboration, and then how much integration in with their peers that they might have with other people. And this was set up specifically for looking at speech and language services. But again, very similar. You could pretty much take out anything that said SLP or speech language IEP in here and insert one of the other areas, and you're going to see the same kinds of things where, it doesn't take as much collaboration in order to provide pull-out services. Now, it does take some, right? Because you always want to connect what you're doing back to what's going on in the classroom based on what the teacher is telling you that they're working on, based on what the student is continuing to struggle with, or some of the interactions that they've had. But that's different than if you were going to do some team teaching or parallel teaching. You're going to have to work together on how that's going to work. But I like this visual of thinking. All right, so when and where? One of the things, scheduling is hard. It's hard even the way you are doing things currently. I know it is hard. And about the time that you think you've got your schedule set, you get a new kid. Or something happens and you've got to make up a bunch of time for a kid who is, or maybe you were out for a while and you've got to make up some time. And then you get an emergency IEP meeting, and, all of these crazy things happen. But one of the things that I think we get so restricted by are the places and the times that we are told, don't take them from this. Don't you dare take them out of recess. Don't you dare take any of their lunchtime away. Don't you dare take them out of our 90 minutes of reading instruction, because by golly, we got to have that. There are so many restrictions because those things are all incredibly important too. So thinking about how can we push into some different areas that might be natural. Pushing in to some of those related arts classes, the electives. How can I support a student's behavior in art and music? Lots of ways. How can I go in and work on vocabulary in art? That sounds crazy, right? There's a lot of vocabulary related to art. There are lots of opportunities for practicing social conversations in art. So thinking about how could I maybe get some of my time in those different settings. Recess and lunch, if you think about all of the social stuff that happens during recess and lunch, the motor stuff that happens at recess and lunch. And again, I know some of you are already doing some of this, thinking, oh my gosh, the kid who's struggling to open their own milk carton or take caps off of things. Yeah, I can write a goal for that. And we could sit and work on that in a separate setting. But why not do it where it counts? Why not work on it with multiple kids so that this kid doesn't stick out to say, we're all going to work on this skill and we're going to do it in a way that's functional. And then English, language arts, and math, thinking, how can I build on some of the instruction that's happening in there? Social studies and science. I mean, really very few things would be off limits if we are going to use more push-in kind of services. This also, if you kind of can get away from the thinking of needing to be in for whatever the period is, right? Whether it's 90 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, we get locked into that in our thinking when we're writing in supports. And when we design supports within an IEP, we really have to shift our thinking back to, here's where the student is, here's where we set the goal, and this is how much service that I think it's going to take to get them from here to here. It's a guess every time that we do it. And we're using information from how they progressed so far and what kind of, time, setting, frequency, all that kind of stuff of the current supports. But we're always thinking about what is it likely to take dosage wise of what I have to give in order to get them to those goals. And it's certainly not going to ever be 60-minute, 45-minute, 90-minute, right? And if you talk to teachers about where could we maybe support this skill, it's usually not going to be for an entire period, because they're also going to tell you, well, part of this time they're going to be sitting taking a quiz, and part of this time I'm going to be reading aloud to them, and part of this time we're going to be writing things down, whatever it is that may not be the best opportunity. But I know you guys have caseloads that are unbelievable, and you're trying to fit all these things in. If you can get a couple of teachers to collaborate with you on this schedule and say, you know what, I really want to work on this in your classroom. If I could have the first half of your period, and then I go into a different classroom and you can structure things so that I can fit into the second half and you can use me in there to support these different skills. Now you've been able to see a lot more kids within that one time block. So it shifts how we write things on IEPs. You can't go back tomorrow and say, I think I'm going to do everything inclusively, because many of your IEPs don't say that. They say you're going to get, in a special ed setting, 20 minutes 3 times a month, or, whatever it is. So you got to start small. Where are the opportunities that I could maybe just switch at one grade level, switch how I do things. And then when that's going and things are ironed out, then maybe I add on another grade level or a particular area. So some of you may have, many different kinds of skills that you're working on, whether it's fine motor, sensory, or for SLPs thinking about, well, I'm supporting vocabulary, I'm supporting creating sentences, I'm supporting articulation. I've got these 2 kids that stutter, you've got all of these different things. So you may find that there are certain things that you think, I'm not ready to shift for that, but I am ready to shift to provide these other supports inclusively. So communication is definitely the way that we make this happen. And I feel like this is a lot of what happens in schools. When you look at that sign, it's like, okay, I know there's a map in there somewhere, but I don't really know where to go. And if you're working with other people, then suddenly there's a lot more communication that has to happen. So part of it is creating those partnerships with some key teachers. Not everybody is going to be open to this. Not that should necessarily make a difference in doing what's right for kids, whether or not you can convince a teacher. But we know that the bottom line is that if we don't have someone on board, it makes it more difficult to make it happen. And we don't want to provide services in a gen ed setting for the sake of providing it in a gen ed setting. We want it to be meaningful and we want it to be effective. So part of it is starting out just talking about the positives with your teachers and likely with your administrators as well. Sharing that the stuff that we support certain kids on, man, you probably got some other kids that could benefit from that as well. Looking at how a student's IEP goals Like, where could we potentially work on it? What activities are you already planning? I'm not asking you to plan anything different in your classroom, but based on what you've already planned, where could we fit me working on IEP goals and you as a teacher working on IEP goals into those plans? And then really emphasizing that this creates a lot more opportunity for generalizing those skills so that they're not just happening. I mean, some of you have heard back from people when you've come to an IEP meeting and said, he's mastered this skill. He does it for me every single time. And the teacher and the parents say, well, I've never seen him do it, right? That happens because sometimes things don't generalize. But when we practice them in the right settings, it's more likely that they're going to generalize because you're demonstrating to the teacher how to support it, how to elicit it, how to make it happen. It's convincing them right in front of them because here, we're showing you how to get that skill out of the student. It's also important that we talk to parents and, again, administrators about this too. We've got to share why it is we're wanting to do this. That least restrictive environment is part of the law. It's part of our obligation to students and part of parents' rights. And so here's why we would want to be more inclusive. Making sure that we talk to them about differentiation within the classroom. What you do is helping the teacher to differentiate their instruction. Kids also, most of our young kids, when we pull them out to go down the hallway, they're happy to go because, sometimes they come back with a sticker or a Jolly Rancher and they love that individual attention. But we kind of hit a wall at some point of the kids who don't want to be called out, don't want to leave the classroom. And it really does reduce that stigma by coming into the classroom. It makes getting support a normal part of the day because anyone can tap into that support. So again, I may be a student with no IEP and I'm just having a rough day and I need someone to help me with some behavioral regulation in the classroom. And that's okay. I get the benefit from that. And I help to normalize what's going on because we all have those times when we need extra support. And really, again, sharing with parents that sometimes if they think that we're trying to reduce our workload by providing services inclusively. And although when you finally get it organized and in place, I think it does help for you to provide services to many students at once, but it's not reducing your workload. This is a hard road. There's a lot of work involved in changing the culture of what we do within a school. But I think when we can sell it to them that, it does make things a lot more meaningful to the student and helps them to generalize those skills. But you also have to be very clear with the parent, the teacher, the administrator, and even with the student that whether or not I'm in the classroom to provide this support, or we did it down in my office or closet or whatever you're in, it's still the service. When I trained with Christy always used an example that, she would go in and provide really good intensive services as a speech language pathologist in the classroom. And then the teacher turns to her and says, so when are you going to pull him for speech? She's like, no, wait, I was just in here for 60 minutes providing all this support. That is his support. That is his specially designed instruction is happening while I'm there. And I'm teaching you how to provide that specially designed instruction. But the message is that speech only happens in the speech room. And then you're going to have teachers who think he's not been getting his support, or a student who goes home and says, I haven't had speech for 6 months. And then you get an angry parent. But when we can communicate that this is how we're proposing to do it, and here is the why, then it's just a better sell to the family. So some of the things that you may want to discuss with your teachers that are willing to do some of this, you may want to, this is part of just general co-teaching, is talking about your work styles and your preferences. So if we are going to carve out a few minutes to talk about things, before school, is that an option? After school, do you need me to come down during your prep period? When is that? Or, how do you like to do this? Whether it's, let's just email it. Let's work together on a Google Doc. Let's text things back and forth. You just have to figure out a way that's going to work best so that you're going to get the best communication. You also may want to have just some conversations about your educational philosophy, just so that you know kind of how things tend to operate, so that you're supporting things rather than working against somebody in a classroom. And some of that has to do with things like even the rules in a classroom. If you're going in as an outside person, you all need to be on the same page. So the rules are the rules. Whether a student needs to raise their hand before asking a question, whether a student is allowed to get up to get something, or they need to ask for permission first. There are a lot of very specific rules. And there's also even some differences in how people approach their classroom. And COVID has thrown another wrench in things with the distancing that's required in a lot of schools. But, there are classrooms that all desks are in rows, others that are in little pods, others that have tables and kids are sitting on cushions on the floor with these low tables. That kind of shifts what you're working with and the opportunities for working in that setting. If everybody's in rows all the time and we never move the desks, and there are little taped corners so that you never have your desk move from that spot, it's going to be really hard to do those stations in a classroom like that. But if you've got a teacher to work with who's a little more flexible, then you're going to have a little bit more success. And then also thinking about some of those logistical concerns about, how are we going to work on those different lessons? How are you going to know what I'm going to fit into? If we're going to do stations, do we plan this together? Do I plan my station and you plan yours, and then we just kind of wing it? How are we going to make that happen so that it's most effective? How are we going to communicate with families? Again, there's some resources on the Padlet that should help a little bit with some of those like ways to phrase things, or things that you could give to teachers or parents or administrators. And then asking the teacher too, if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to send the kid to you? Do you want me to ask you so that everyone hears the question? And am I okay to answer a question if Johnny says, can I go to the bathroom? Am I good to grant that permission, or does it have to go back to you as the classroom teacher? Again, no right or wrong answer to any of those questions, but it's sure nice to know those things and work some of those things out prior to, getting into a lesson and then finding out that I've just made you upset or whatever. So this is just a little snippet from somebody that wrote to how I can share with a parent. So I'll rarely work with your child outside of the classroom, since I think it's important that he or she sees the need to use language inside the room during all parts of the school day. And this allows the teachers and paraprofessionals to watch so they can continue to work on language skills when I'm not in the room. And I think this is a really important part. If you break your leg and your doctor recommends that as part of your recovery, you go to physical therapy, for a pretty short period of time, and they run you through some exercises, right? But then they don't think that just doing those exercises with them at their facility is going to make a whole lot of improvement. What they tell you is go home and practice this at least twice a day for 20 minutes. I want you to run through this series of exercises. That is what they expect is going to make a difference. And so I know a lot of you will make home packets, right? You make things that parents can work on at home with students, or that they can work on over the summer, or things like that. But if we think about what happens in our outside support sessions versus if we could teach a teacher how to support that in the classroom and do it all day, right? Support it all day. You're not always working on that particular skill, but looking for the opportunities to reinforce, to model, all of those kinds of things. We're going to see a lot more improvement in those IEP goals than we ever thought possible. But it has to be deliberate in our way of teaching and supporting the teachers or other people at school who might be working with a student. Teachers, paraprofessionals, sometimes even, our cafeteria monitors who maybe just really don't know how to catch a student's meltdown early enough and support them. There are a lot of things that can be done by modeling this. So the bottom line is, what really matters here? It matters, the kids matter, and making sure that we find effective ways to support the kids matter. I think we get so hung up on, did my IEP pass the test? Is everything correct? Did I get rid of all the stop signs, right? I want those green check marks in the system. Did I meet my minutes? And those things, they're part of the job. They're part of making sure that we keep ourselves above board legally and meet those obligations. But the true purpose of what we do is to try and get kids in a better state than they were before we got them. We're always looking to increase those skills. And again, we have much more of an impact when we are also supporting the adults that support the kids all the time than if we were just treating the patients, right? So it is more of a shift from thinking of kind of that medical model of how we do things to a more consultative and collaborative and a model that builds on all of the different support systems that students have. All right, so we are down to kind of our last 7 minutes. So I want to make sure I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat, but I would encourage you, if you have any thoughts about, what do we do? How do we make this happen? Or if you've had a good experience with making some of this happen that you'd want to share, then I think other people would really like to see that as well. And while I leave some time for anyone to type that might want, I wish this was like an iMessage where I could see that someone is typing so I know exactly how long to wait. But what I would encourage you to do is if you could scan the barcode with your camera on the left, or you can enter the evaluation link, which I'm going to put in the chat really quick. Sure I typed it correctly. All right. So if you would complete just our standard quick evaluation, we would really like to have your feedback. I know this is not always an ideal situation when we have these shorter sessions. It's nice to be able to dig a little deeper and have that good conversation in person. But these are crazy times. So we're doing the best we can to make sure that we know a lot of you have travel restrictions within your districts too. And we want to recognize that this learning still needs to be available. So if you could fill out that evaluation, and then if you're interested in looking at any of our other training opportunities, the code on the right will take you to our online catalog and registration. My contact information is right here. You are welcome to reach out to me by email or text anytime if you have concerns, or if you would like a little support about maybe how to get this started. But again, I would encourage you to check out the things that are on the Padlet, because some of those things can help kind of get things started, help you know where to go next. And to just think about one little notch forward on that LRE continuum, just making things a little more inclusive this year and a little more inclusive the next year, until the mindset truly is that most of what we do happens in that gen ed setting and supports all of the learning that's going on with students. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I will kind of shut this down. I want to thank Faith, who did our captioning today. We really appreciate that service. And you all will get a recording of this sent to you by email. So you're welcome to share that with any of your colleagues or administrators, or anybody that you think may benefit from this session. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.